Hello there, night wanderers and deep thinkers. How was your day? What time is it where you are right now? I love knowing our community spans the globe, connecting minds across time zones. Have you ever noticed reality felt off? After tonight's story about simulation theory, let me know what you think. Could we be living in a digital construct? And what conspiracies should we explore next? Alien abduction, bloodline control, CERN opening dimensional doorways, or dreams as glimpses into parallel lives? If you enjoy stories that question reality itself, please subscribe to Sleep Theories. We explore mysteries that hide in plain sight and possibilities beyond the edge of normal. Now, settle in as we explore a tale about a man who began to notice his perfectly ordinary world might not be quite as real as it appeared. Daniel Cross had always prided himself on being rational. At 33, he'd built a comfortable life analysing data patterns for Nexus Cybersecurity, a mid-sized firm in downtown Portland. His days followed predictable rhythms. Morning coffee, subway commute, 8 hours of parsing network logs and threat assessments, evening run along the Willamette River, dinner, television, sleep, rinse and repeat. He found comfort in patterns, in the logical flow of cause and effect, in the way numbers always told a story if you knew how to read them. Conspiracy theories were for other people, the kind who saw hidden meanings in cloud formations and believed the government was tracking their grocery purchases. Daniel dealt in facts, in quantifiable data, in the solid ground of empirical evidence, which made what happened on that Tuesday morning in October all the more unsettling. He first noticed the man with the newspaper on the 8:47 train to downtown. Middle-aged, greying beard, navy windbreaker with a small coffee stain near the left pocket. The man held a copy of the Oregonian folded to the sports section, and Daniel caught a glimpse of the headline, Blazers drop season opener in overtime thriller. The date at the top read October 15th. Nothing unusual there. Daniel barely registered the moment. Just another face in the morning crowd. But the next day, Wednesday the 16th, the same man sat in the same seat, wearing the same navy windbreaker with the same coffee stain, reading the same newspaper folded to the same sports section. The headline was identical, Blazers drop season opener in overtime thriller. The paper still showed October 15th as the date. Daniel blinked hard, assuming his eyes were playing tricks on him. Maybe it was yesterday's paper. People sometimes read day-old news. But as he watched, the man turned the page with the exact same gesture he'd used the day before, a quick snap of the wrist followed by smoothing the crease with his thumb. The timing was identical, down to the second. A chill ran down Daniel's spine, but he forced himself to look away. Déjà vu, nothing more. The human brain was notorious for creating false patterns, for making connections where none existed. He'd read enough about cognitive biases in his line of work to know that the mind could play elaborate tricks. Thursday morning brought the same scene again. Same man, same seat, same windbreaker, same newspaper with the same date, same headline, same gestures performed with mechanical precision. This time Daniel watched more carefully, noting details. The man blinked exactly 17 times while reading the first paragraph, cleared his throat at precisely 8:52, and folded the paper at 8:54 just as the train pulled into Pioneer Square Station. By Friday, Daniel was timing everything. The man's routine never varied by even a second. Every gesture, every movement, every micro-expression followed the same predetermined sequence. It was as if he were watching the same video loop played over and over again. On Monday, Daniel positioned himself with a clear view and pulled out his phone to record the phenomenon. Through his camera screen, he watched the man go through his routine, but something was different. The timestamp on the newspaper now read October 21st, and the headline had changed to City Council approves downtown development project. Yet the man's movements remained identical in every other respect. Daniel's hands shook slightly as he ended the recording. Later that evening he reviewed the footage on his laptop. The video showed the subway car, other passengers reading or scrolling through their phones, but the seat where the newspaper man should have been was empty. According to his phone, Daniel had recorded nothing but a vacant seat for 3 minutes and 14 seconds. He watched the playback 5 times, rewinding and fast-forwarding, checking every frame. No man, no newspaper, no Navy windbreaker. Just empty space where his eyes had seen something his camera hadn't captured. That night Daniel lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his analytical mind churning. There had to be a logical explanation. Stress, perhaps. He'd been working long hours on a particularly complex network intrusion case. Sleep deprivation could cause hallucinations. Or maybe it was a medical issue. Temporal lobe epilepsy could cause déjà vu experiences. But even as he ran through the possibilities, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a different question. What if what he'd seen was real, and the recording was the glitch? Daniel had always believed that reality was solid, quantifiable, governed by physical laws that could be measured and understood. But as he finally drifted off to sleep that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the foundation of his rational world a crack had appeared. And through that crack, something impossible was beginning to seep in. The subway incident should have been an isolated anomaly, a weird story to tell friends over beer. But once Daniel started noticing glitches, they seemed to multiply like a virus spreading through his perception of reality. 3 days after the newspaper man disappeared from his video, Daniel was walking home from work when he passed the streetlight on the corner of 5th and Morrison. It flickered. Not unusual. Portland city infrastructure wasn't known for its reliability. But as he walked past the same corner the next evening, it flickered again. Same pattern, 3 quick flashes, pause, 2 more flashes, steady light. Curious, Daniel timed his walk to arrive at the same spot at the same time for a week. Every evening at 6:23 p.m, the streetlight performed its little dance. 3 quick flashes, pause, 2 more, steady. Never varying, never random, as if it were programmed. On Thursday he brought a stopwatch. The sequence lasted exactly 4.7 seconds every time. He researched streetlight maintenance schedules, electrical grid fluctuations, even lunar cycles that might affect electromagnetic fields. Nothing explained the precision of the timing. The rain incident happened on a grey Saturday morning in November. Daniel was crossing the Hawthorne Bridge when a light drizzle began. Normal Pacific Northwest weather, except that he could see individual droplets freezing mid-air, suspended like tiny glass beads about 6 feet above the pavement. The rain would stop for exactly 3 seconds, drops hanging motionless in defiance of gravity, then resume as if someone had pressed play on a cosmic remote control. Other pedestrians walked through the suspended drops without seeming to notice. Daniel pulled out his phone again, recorded the phenomenon, and later found only normal footage of steady rain. But his eyes had seen something else entirely. The encounters with people began to disturb him most of all. A woman in a red coat bumped into him outside Pioneer Courthouse Square, muttering sorry as she hurried past. The next day, the same woman in the same red coat bumped into him in exactly the same way, at the same spot with the same apologetic murmur. When it happened a third time, Daniel tried to follow her, but she vanished into a crowd that seemed to shift and close around her like water. On the 4th occurrence, he spoke to her directly. "Excuse me, I think we've met before." The woman stopped, turned, and looked at him with eyes that seemed to focus somewhere beyond his face. "You're not supposed to notice," she said quietly. Then louder, as if reading from a script, "Sorry." She hurried away, but this time Daniel watched her carefully. After about 30 feet, she simply stopped existing. One moment she was there, the next, the space she'd occupied was empty, and the people around her continued walking as if she'd never been there at all. Daniel's sleep became fitful. He started keeping a journal, documenting every anomaly with the methodical precision he brought to his work. Timeline discrepancies, impossible weather patterns, people who repeated behaviours with mechanical precision, objects that appeared and disappeared from his peripheral vision. The most unsettling entry came on a Tuesday night in late November. "Today I noticed that my reflection in the bathroom mirror was delayed by approximately 0.3 seconds. When I raised my left hand, the reflection raised its hand a beat later. When I tested this deliberately, moving in unpredictable patterns, the delay remained consistent. Recorded video of myself in mirror shows normal synchronized reflection. But I know what I saw. He began researching simulation theory, quantum mechanics, parallel universes, anything that might explain what he was experiencing. The internet was full of people reporting similar phenomena, but most were dismissed as hallucinations, mental illness, or attention-seeking behaviour. Daniel found forums dedicated to reality glitches, where users shared stories of impossible coincidences, temporal loops, and encounters with people who didn't seem quite real. One thread caught his attention. A user named Lena_88 had posted a series of photographs that looked like visual static superimposed over normal city scenes. The images showed what appeared to be text strings floating in the air, lines of code rendered visible against the background of reality. These appear during storms, Lena_88 had written. Weather system updates. If you know how to look, you can see the patch notes hanging in the sky. Most responses mocked the post, calling it obvious Photoshop work. But something about the images nagged at Daniel. The code strings weren't random. They followed syntax patterns similar to what he worked with every day, database queries and conditional statements formatted in a way that reminded him of environmental physics engines. He private messaged Lena_88, expecting no response. To his surprise, she replied within hours. "You're the data analyst from Portland, aren't you? The one who's been posting videos of temporal loops on TikTok. We should meet. There are things I need to show you. Things that will make the newspaper man seem like a minor bug." Daniel's blood went cold. He'd never mentioned his location in his messages, never connected his real identity to his anonymous video posts. Yet somehow, this stranger knew exactly who he was and what he'd been experiencing. Against every rational instinct screaming in his head, he agreed to meet her. The coffee shop she'd suggested was a small place called Quantum Grounds on the east side, the kind of establishment that catered to Portland's tech community, with names like the Schrödinger and Double Shot of Espresso Martini Universe. Daniel arrived early, choosing a corner table with a clear view of the entrance. She walked in at exactly 3 p.m, as if she'd been programmed for punctuality. Late 20s, dark hair pulled back in a functional ponytail, wearing a black jacket over jeans that looked expensive but lived in. Her eyes swept the room with the systematic precision of someone scanning for threats or anomalies. "Daniel Cross," she said, approaching his table without hesitation. "You look exactly like your employee ID photo. How did you access Nexus Cybersecurity's HR database? Please, their firewall is weaker than wet tissue paper." She sat down across from him, pulling out a tablet. "But I didn't dig into your employment records to stalk you. I've been tracking people who noticed the glitches. You're one of the few who's been systematic about documentation. You're Lena_88, Lena Vaughn, systems engineer, former DARPA contractor, current digital archaeologist." She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "And someone who's spent the last 3 years collecting evidence that our reality isn't what we think it is." Daniel felt a familiar skepticism rising. "You're talking about simulation theory, the idea that we're living in some kind of computer program. Not just talking about it, proving it." She activated her tablet, showing him a file directory with hundreds of entries. "What you've been experiencing aren't glitches in your perception, Daniel. They're glitches in the system itself, rendering errors, script loops, NPCs behaving outside their programmed parameters. That's impossible. 6 months ago, you would have said the same thing about a man reading the same newspaper for eternity or rain that stops in midair. But you've seen it. You've recorded it. The question isn't whether it's possible. The question is what you're going to do about it." She pulled up one of her storm photographs on the tablet. Up close, Daniel could see that the floating text strings weren't added in post-production. They had depth, casting shadows on the buildings below them, interacting with the light and weather in ways that would be nearly impossible to fake. "These appear during what I call maintenance cycles," Lena explained. "Major weather events, power outages, significant traffic disruptions, anything that requires widespread environmental updates. Someone, or something, is constantly modifying the world around us, and occasionally they make mistakes that people like us can perceive." Daniel stared at the image. his analytical mind trying to find flaws in what he was seeing. Even if this were true, even if we were living in some kind of simulation, who would create it? And why? Those are the right questions, Lena said, smiling for the first time since she'd sat down. And I think I've found a way to get some answers, but it's going to require us to go places that officially don't exist and access systems that we're definitely not authorised to touch. That sounds like a recipe for federal prison. Maybe. Or maybe it's the only way to find out whether we're prisoners already, just in a more sophisticated kind of cell. She closed the tablet and stood up. I'm going to give you my contact information. When you're ready to see how deep this goes, call me. But Daniel? Yeah? Once you start pulling on this thread, you can't unknow what you learn. The comfortable illusion of a normal life isn't something you can get back. Make sure you really want the truth before you take that step. She left him sitting in the coffee shop with a business card that simply read, Lena Vaughn, Digital Archaeology, and a phone number. No email, no address, no website. As Daniel sat there turning the card over in his hands, he wondered if he'd just met someone who could explain everything he'd been experiencing, or if he'd stumbled into the orbit of a brilliant conspiracy theorist whose delusions were sophisticated enough to seem credible. That night he called the number. It went straight to voicemail. If you're calling this number, you've already seen enough to know that something is wrong. Leave a message, and I'll decide whether you're ready for the next step. After the beep, Daniel found himself speaking into the void. It's Daniel. I need to know what you meant about places that officially don't exist. And Lena, I think I've already crossed the line where I can pretend this is all normal, so whatever comes next, I'm in. He hung up and waited for reality to prove him wrong one more time. Lena called him back at 2:17 a.m, waking him from uneasy dreams filled with floating newspaper headlines and frozen raindrops. Meet me at the parking structure on 3rd and Taylor tomorrow at 11 p.m, she said without preamble. Bring a laptop, portable battery pack, and anything you might need if we're going to be away from civilization for a few hours. And Daniel, don't tell anyone where you're going. Not friends, not family, not even a note on your kitchen counter. The line went dead before he could ask questions. Daniel spent the following day in a state of nervous anticipation, barely able to concentrate on his work analysing network traffic logs. Every mundane task felt surreal now, as if he were going through the motions of a life that might not even be real. He found himself studying his co-workers' faces, looking for signs that they might be as artificial as the newspaper man on the subway. At 10:45 p.m, he stood in the dimly lit parking garage clutching a backpack containing his laptop, extra batteries, and a growing sense that he was about to step across a threshold from which there might be no return. Lena arrived in a black Honda Civic with tinted windows, gesturing for him to get in without turning off the engine. As they pulled out onto the empty downtown streets, Daniel noticed that she'd covered her license plate with mud, obscuring most of the numbers and letters. "Where are we going?" he asked. "Somewhere that doesn't exist," she replied cryptically, at least not according to any public records. They drove east out of Portland, past the suburban sprawl and into the dark forests of the Cascade foothills. Lena took seemingly random turns onto back roads that weren't marked on Daniel's phone's GPS. After about an hour, she pulled off onto a dirt track that was barely visible through the tree line. "Phone off," she instructed, powering down her own device. "From here on, we're invisible." The dirt road wound through dense forest for another 20 minutes, before opening into a clearing dominated by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Beyond the fence, Daniel could see a cluster of low concrete buildings and rows of large metal structures that looked like shipping containers. What is this place? Officially? Decommissioned telecommunications facility, abandoned since 2019 when Pacific Northwest Telecom went bankrupt. Lena parked the car behind a screen of trees and retrieved bolt cutters from her trunk. Unofficially? Take a look at those power lines. Daniel followed her gaze to thick electrical cables running to the facility from multiple directions. For an abandoned site, it was consuming an enormous amount of power. "Someone's been very careful to make sure this place stays off the radar," Lena continued, approaching the fence. "Property records show it as empty land scheduled for environmental remediation. Satellite images are mysteriously corrupted or outdated, and the security system is about 10 times more sophisticated than anything a bankrupt telecom company would have installed." She made quick work of the fence, creating an opening just large enough for them to squeeze through. Motion sensors swept the compound with regular precision, but Lena had obviously studied their patterns. She led Daniel in a zigzagging route between the buildings, pausing at precise intervals to avoid detection. "How many times have you done this?" Daniel whispered. "This is my 4th visit. First 3 times I could only get close enough to confirm that the place is very much not abandoned. Tonight I'm hoping to actually get inside." They reached the main building, a windowless concrete structure that hummed with the sound of massive cooling systems. Lena produced a tablet connected to a device that looked like a sophisticated lockpick. She plugged it into a maintenance panel next to a heavy steel door. "Custom hardware," she explained as lines of code scrolled across her screen, "designed to interface with industrial control systems. If I'm right about what's in there, standard security protocols won't even recognize this as an intrusion attempt." The lock disengaged with a soft click. Inside, the building was a cathedral of technology. Rows upon rows of server racks stretched into the distance, their status LEDs creating a galaxy of blinking lights in the dim emergency lighting. The air thrummed with the sound of thousands of cooling fans and hard drives spinning at tremendous speeds. "Jesus," Daniel breathed. "This is massive. What kind of processing power would require this much hardware?" "The kind that could simulate reality for several million entities," Lena replied, moving deeper into the facility with practiced confidence. "Look at the server labels." Daniel examined the nearest rack. Instead of standard manufacturer stickers, each unit was marked with cryptic designations: World State Pacific NWs07, Entity Profiles Batch 427, Weather Engine Cascade Range. "These aren't normal server functions," he said, his voice barely audible over the mechanical chorus surrounding them. "No, they're not." Lena had found a workstation terminal and was connecting her laptop to it via a series of adapters. "And if I'm right about the file structure, we should be able to access some very interesting data." Her fingers flew over the keyboard, executing a series of commands that bypassed security protocols with disturbing ease. Database interfaces opened on her screen, revealing directory structures that made Daniel's head spin. Simulation, environment, Pacific weather cycles, entities, human analogues, behavior, scripts, updates, reality, patches, November 2024. Admin, maintenance logs, anomaly, reports. "This is impossible," Daniel said. But even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't true anymore. Impossible was a luxury he could no longer afford. "Look at this," Lena said, opening a file labelled Entity Profiles. Names scrolled past, thousands of them, each associated with detailed behavioural parameters, memory sets, and status indicators. These are profiles for every person in the simulation: personality matrices, relationship networks, employment history, daily routine variations. She searched for Daniel Cross. His profile appeared on screen, complete with his social security number, employment history, psychological assessment scores, and a detailed log of his daily activities going back months. But it was the status field that made his blood run cold. Anomaly detection, active, query status, escalating, recommended, action, monitor, contain. "They know," he said quietly. "Whatever is running this, they know I've been noticing the glitches. It gets worse." Lena pulled up another file. Maintenance log, November 2024. Recent entries detailed rendering errors in the Pacific Northwest simulation, including specific references to temporal loops, weather system malfunctions, and entity behavior outside scripted parameters. One entry made Daniel's hands tremble. Subject D cross PDX 33 continuing to document anomalies. Recommend personality adjustment or memory wipe before query status reaches critical threshold. "We need to get out of here," Daniel said, panic creeping into his voice. "Not yet. There's something else I need to show you." Lena opened a directory labelled Update Cycles and pulled up a calendar of scheduled maintenance events. Look at the dates. Every major disruption Daniel could remember from the past year was listed. Power outages, traffic accidents, even personal events like his grandfather's funeral. All scheduled in advance, all part of a predetermined pattern of reality updates. Your life isn't your own, Daniel. None of our lives are. We're characters in someone else's story, following scripts we don't even know we've been given. A new file caught Daniel's eye. Exit Protocols. He pointed to it, and Lena clicked it open. The document was heavily encrypted, but the summary was readable. Procedures for entity extraction and consciousness transfer, for use only under direct administrative authorization. Extraction to where? Daniel asked. That's what we need to find out, Lena said, copying files to her laptop as quickly as possible. But first we need to... Alarms began blaring throughout the facility. Red lights flashed and automated voices announced, "Unauthorized access detected. Security protocols initiated. Facility lockdown in progress." "Time to go!" Lena yanked her laptop free from the workstation and ran toward the exit. Daniel close behind. Heavy steel barriers were beginning to descend across doorways, sealing off sections of the building. They reached the main door just as it started to close, sliding through the gap with inches to spare. Outside, floodlights illuminated the compound, and Daniel could hear the sound of vehicles approaching through the forest. "This way!" Lena led him away from the building toward the perimeter fence. But as they ran, Daniel noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. The stars in the sky above them weren't moving naturally. They pulsed in synchronized patterns like pixels on a vast screen refreshing in real time. "Lena," he called out, "look up!" She followed his gaze and cursed under her breath. The whole sky is updating. They're not just modifying local reality, they're rebuilding the entire visual framework. As they reached the fence and squeezed through the opening Lena had cut, Daniel looked back at the facility one more time. In the distance, he could see vehicles with no headlights moving through the trees, autonomous security units that didn't need human drivers. "What have we stumbled into?" he asked as they reached the car. "The control room for our entire existence," Lena replied, starting the engine. "And now that we've seen it, I don't think they're going to just let us walk away and forget about it." As they drove through the dark forest, Daniel realized that his old life, his comfortable routine of data analysis and predictable patterns, was over. Whatever came next, he was no longer just an observer of glitches in reality. He was a threat to the system itself. They drove through the night in tense silence, taking back roads and changing direction frequently to avoid any potential tracking. Lena seemed to know every dirt path and forestry road in the region, navigating without GPS through terrain that Daniel didn't recognize from any map. "Where did you learn to do all this?" he asked, as she made another seemingly random turn onto a narrow gravel track. 3 years of running from people who don't officially exist," she replied. "You pick up skills when your survival depends on staying invisible." They ended up at a cabin deep in the Gifford Pinchot National Forest, a rustic structure that looked abandoned from the outside, but proved to be equipped with sophisticated electronic equipment hidden behind false walls and under floorboards. Lena activated a signal-blocking Faraday cage that surrounded the entire building, then finally seemed to relax. "Safe house?" Daniel asked, looking around at the curious combination of wilderness living and high-tech surveillance gear. "One of several. I've been preparing for this conversation for a long time." She pulled out the laptop containing the files they'd stolen from the facility and connected it to a larger workstation. "Now we can really dig into what we found." For the next 6 hours, they pored over the data, piecing together a picture of reality that was far more complex and disturbing than either of them had imagined. The files revealed not just a simulation, but a layered system of reality management that operated on multiple scales simultaneously. The entity profiles weren't just behavioral scripts. They were complete psychological models that predicted and guided human decision-making at the subconscious level. Every choice Daniel thought he'd made independently had been influenced by carefully calibrated environmental factors, from the placement of advertisements on his commute to the availability of certain food items at his local grocery store. "Look at your employment history," Lena said, pulling up his profile. "You didn't randomly get hired at Nexus Cybersecurity. You were placed there because your skill set was needed for a specific purpose, analysing network patterns that could potentially detect simulation infrastructure." Daniel stared at the screen in horrified fascination. They hired me to catch myself? More precisely, they hired you to develop tools that could identify the kind of anomalies you've been experiencing, but they underestimated your ability to recognise the patterns when they appeared in your own life. The deeper they dug, the more sophisticated the system revealed itself to be. Weather patterns weren't just simulated. They were designed to influence population behaviour on a macro level. Economic fluctuations, political events, even cultural trends were all managed variables in a vast social experiment. But who's running it? Daniel asked. These systems are too complex for human administrators. The processing power alone would require resources beyond anything that exists on Earth. That's where it gets really interesting, Lena said, opening a file labelled ADMINLOGS. Look at the command structure. The administrative hierarchy showed human operators at the lowest level, responsible for routine maintenance and minor adjustments. Above them were automated systems that handled most day-to-day operations, but at the top of the chain were entities designated only as primary controllers, with access levels that seemed to transcend the simulation entirely. They're not human, Daniel said, studying the command patterns. The decision-making algorithms are too fast, too complex. And look at these timestamps. Some of these administrative actions are logged from outside our time stream entirely. External operators, Lena agreed, running our reality like a massive multiplayer game. But we're not the players, we're the NPCs. They found references to other simulation clusters. Simulation cluster, Europe, West. Simulation cluster, Asia, Pacific. Simulation cluster, Americas, South. Each managed by the same type of external controllers, each following similar behavioural modification protocols. It's global, Daniel breathed. This isn't just our local area, they're simulating the entire planet. Maybe multiple versions of it, Lena said, opening a directory labelled Parallel Instances. Look at these backup files, alternative timeline branches, experimental social scenarios, beta versions of historical events. The implications were staggering. Not only were they living in a simulation, but they were potentially just one version among many, existing alongside countless parallel realities where different choices had been made, different variables tested. There's something else, Lena said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Look at the file modification dates on your personal profile. Daniel examined the timestamps. His profile had been accessed and modified hundreds of times over the past few weeks, always within hours of when he'd experienced a major glitch or anomaly. They've been adjusting my parameters in real time, he said. Every time I notice something wrong, they tweak my psychological profile to try to make me rationalise it away. But it's not working anymore. Your anomaly detection has reached what they call a critical threshold. The system can't correct your perception without completely rewriting your personality, and apparently that would violate some kind of protocol. Lena pulled up another file. Extraction candidates. Daniel's name was at the top of the list, along with detailed assessments of his simulation integration status and consciousness stability ratings. Extraction candidates for what? I think they're planning to pull you out, Lena said. Remove your consciousness from the simulation and do something else with it. But I haven't been able to crack the files that explain what happens after extraction. They work through the morning, mapping out the structure of their simulated reality and identifying key control systems, the weather management centres, traffic coordination networks, media content distribution systems. Every aspect of modern life was revealed to be carefully orchestrated. There has to be a way to break free from this, Daniel said as exhaustion began to set in. If consciousness can be extracted, maybe it can also be liberated. Maybe. But first we need to understand what we're actually dealing with. The files reference something called the maintenance layer, a level of reality that exists between the simulation and whatever's running it. I think that's where we need to go. Lena showed him technical specifications for accessing the maintenance layer, which apparently required physical proximity to what the files called reality anchor points. Locations where the simulation infrastructure interfaced directly with external control systems. According to these coordinates, there's a major anchor point in the Nevada desert, about 200 miles northeast of Las Vegas. It's designated as a primary interface node with direct connection to the external control network. Daniel studied the location on a map. That's in the middle of nowhere. What would be there? Officially, nothing. It's not even marked as government land, just empty desert that doesn't appear on any public records. But according to these files, it's one of the most important locations in our entire simulated reality. You want to go there? I want to break through to the next layer, Lena said. I want to see what's really on the other side of this simulation, and I think that facility in Nevada is our best chance. Daniel looked at his hands, wondering if they were real or just convincing approximations of flesh and bone. Everything he'd believed about his life, his choices, his identity, all of it was based on carefully maintained illusions. What if we don't like what we find out there, he asked. What if we hate what we're living in here, Lena countered. At least out there we might have a chance at something real. That afternoon, they began planning their journey to Nevada. Lena had vehicles and equipment cached at various locations across the western states, resources she'd accumulated during her 3 years of investigation. The trip would take them through some of the most isolated terrain in North America, following routes that wouldn't appear in any surveillance systems. As they prepared to leave the cabin, Daniel took one last look at the stolen files. His profile showed that his anomaly detection level had increased again overnight, simply from learning what he'd learned. The system knew that he knew, and it was running out of ways to maintain the illusion of normalcy. There's no going back, is there? He said. There never was, Lena replied. The moment you started noticing the glitches, your old life became unsustainable. The only question now is whether we find the truth before the system decides we know too much. They drove south through Oregon and into California, staying off major highways and avoiding populated areas. Daniel watched the landscape through the passenger window, wondering how much of what he saw was real, and how much was just sophisticated rendering. The trees, the mountains, the sky itself, all potentially nothing more than convincing visual data processed in real time. But as they drove deeper into the desert, something strange began to happen. The landscape started repeating itself, not subtly, but obviously, like a video game with limited environmental assets. The same rock formations, the same scraggly trees, the same distant mountains appeared again and again in patterns that became impossible to ignore. We're reaching the edge of the rendered area, Lena explained. Beyond this point, the simulation starts cutting corners, recycling assets to save processing power. Most people never travel far enough off the beaten path to notice, but once you see it, it becomes obvious. They drove for hours through increasingly repetitive terrain, following GPS coordinates toward a point that didn't exist on any official map. As the sun began to set, Daniel saw something on the horizon that made him question whether they were still in the same reality they'd started in. A massive black structure rose from the desert floor, not built but grown, like a crystalline formation that had emerged from the earth itself. It pulsed with a faint luminescence that seemed to shift through spectrums of light that Daniel's eyes couldn't quite process. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. "That," Lena said, slowing the vehicle to a stop, "is what a reality anchor point looks like when you're close enough to see it without the camouflage rendering." The structure defied easy description. As they approached on foot, leaving their vehicle hidden behind a cluster of rocks that Daniel was now certain were copy-pasted environmental assets, the monolith seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of observation. Sometimes it appeared to be made of polished obsidian, other times it looked like liquid metal frozen in an impossible geometric form. The files mentioned the direct observation of anchor points could cause perceptual distortions, Lena said, checking readings on a device that looked like a modified electromagnetic field detector. Our brains aren't designed to process something that exists partially outside our dimensional framework. As they got closer, Daniel began to hear it, a low-frequency hum that seemed to resonate in his bones rather than his ears. The sound carried information he realized, data streams that his consciousness could somehow interpret even though his rational mind couldn't understand the language. "It's communicating," he said, stopping about 50 feet from the base of the structure. "I can hear it thinking." "That's the interface connection," Lena explained. "The anchor points aren't just hardware. They're designed to interface directly with consciousness itself. If we get close enough, we might be able to access the maintenance layer directly." What if it's a trap? What if the whole thing is designed to lure people like us in? Lena considered this. Maybe it is. But at this point, what choice do we have? They already know we've accessed their systems. Our profiles are already flagged for extraction. We can either let them come to us on their terms, or we can try to make contact on ours. Daniel approached the monolith, his perception of reality becoming increasingly unstable with each step. The desert around them flickered between different visual styles, sometimes photorealistic, sometimes obviously computer-generated, occasionally dissolving into wireframe models that revealed the underlying mathematical structure of their environment. When he was within arm's reach of the surface, Daniel extended his hand and touched the structure. The world exploded into information. Suddenly, Daniel could see the code underlying everything. The desert, the sky, Lena herself, all revealed as incredibly sophisticated data constructs, operating within a vast computational matrix. But more than that, he could see beyond the simulation to the infrastructure supporting it. Massive servers the size of cities, processing arrays that stretched across dimensions his mind couldn't fully grasp, and overseeing it all, entities that were definitely not human. They weren't malevolent exactly, but they weren't benevolent either. They regarded the simulated humans with the same detached interest that a scientist might show toward bacteria in a petri dish. Through the interface, Daniel accessed administrative logs that painted a picture of humanity's true situation. Earth had been damaged somehow, not destroyed, but rendered uninhabitable by some catastrophe that the records referred to only as the convergence event. The remaining human population had been transferred into protective simulations, while the physical planet underwent some kind of restoration process. But that had been over 200 years ago, and the restoration had stalled. The entities managing the simulations, referred to in the logs as custodians, had concluded that returning humanity to physical existence was no longer feasible. The simulation had become permanent, with humans living out artificial lives in a digital preservation project that would continue indefinitely. "Daniel?" Lena's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Daniel, you need to disconnect. Something's coming." Through his expanded awareness, Daniel could sense vehicles approaching across the desert, not the autonomous security units they'd encountered at the Oregon facility, but something far more sophisticated. Custodian representatives dispatched to deal with the anomalous humans who had achieved unauthorized interface access. He tried to pull his hand away from the monolith, but the connection had become bidirectional. The structure was now accessing his consciousness as thoroughly as he was accessing its data systems. Information flooded through him. The locations of thousands of other reality anchor points across the globe, the true scope of the simulation network, the existence of multiple experimental reality variants where different versions of human civilization were being tested and refined. And something else. An exit protocol that he hadn't seen in the stolen files. A way to extract consciousness from the simulation entirely, to transfer human awareness to somewhere else. The destination was unclear, but the process was real and available to anyone who could access it through a primary interface node. "Daniel, they're almost here. We have to go." With tremendous effort, Daniel severed the connection and stumbled backward from the monolith. His vision swam as his perception adjusted back to normal reality, or at least to the simulation's version of normal reality. "I saw it," he gasped. "I saw everything. Lena, we're not prisoners, we're refugees. Humanity is living in this simulation because Earth was destroyed, and the things running it are trying to preserve us, and tell me later," she said, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward their vehicle. "Right now, we need to focus on not getting captured by whatever those things are." Daniel looked toward the approaching lights and saw vehicles that moved without wheels, floating silently across the desert terrain. As they got closer, he could make out humanoid figures inside, but they moved with the mechanical precision he'd learned to associate with entities operating outside normal human parameters. "They're not here to hurt us," he said as they reached their car. "They're here to offer me a choice." "What kind of choice?" "Extraction. Transfer out of the simulation to somewhere else." They can't keep adjusting my parameters without violating their preservation protocols, so they're offering me an exit. The floating vehicles had surrounded them now, forming a loose perimeter but not approaching closer. One of the figures stepped out, or rather materialised outside its vehicle without appearing to open a door or hatch. It looked human at first glance, but the proportions were subtly wrong. Slightly too tall, features that were perfectly symmetrical in an uncanny way, movements that were too fluid and controlled. When it spoke, its voice carried the same harmonic frequencies Daniel had heard from the monolith. "Daniel Cross, your query has exceeded containment parameters. Resolution is required." "What are my options?" Daniel asked, surprised by his own calm. "Memory adjustment and return to standard simulation parameters, or consciousness extraction and transfer to external substrate." "What's external substrate?" "Reality beyond simulation framework. Physical existence in restored dimensional matrix." Lena stepped closer to Daniel. "It's talking about the real world. They're offering to send you back to whatever's left of actual Earth." "Affirmative," the entity said. "Simulation subjects who achieve critical awareness threshold may elect extraction. Process is irreversible. External conditions significantly different from simulation environment." Daniel felt the weight of the choice settling on him. Return to the comfortable illusion of his artificial life, with his memory wiped of everything he'd learned, or step into an unknown reality that might be wonderful or terrible, but would at least be real. "What about Lena?" he asked. Lena Vaughn consciousness matrix demonstrates incompatible parameters for extraction. Simulation integration too extensive. Memory adjustment recommended. "No," Daniel said firmly. "If I go, she goes with me." "Not possible. External substrate cannot support compromised consciousness patterns." Daniel looked at Lena, seeing something in her expression that he hadn't noticed before. A flicker. A moment where her face seemed to glitch like a digital image with corrupted data. "Lena," he said quietly, "how long have you known?" She smiled sadly. "I was hoping you wouldn't figure it out." "Yes, Daniel. I'm not like you. I'm what they call a guided experience facilitator. Essentially a very sophisticated NPC designed to help anomalous subjects work through their awareness crisis." "You're not real?" "I'm real within the simulation. My thoughts and feelings are genuine, even if my consciousness wasn't born the same way yours was. I was created to help people like you navigate the choice you're facing now." Daniel felt the ground shifting beneath his feet again, but this time it wasn't a glitch in the simulation. It was the deeper realization that even his rebellion against the system had been anticipated and managed. So this whole journey, finding the files, coming here, it was all orchestrated. "Not orchestrated," the custodian entity interjected. "Facilitated. Your awareness trajectory was inevitable. Guided experience increases probability of optimal choice resolution." "Which is what, exactly?" "Voluntary extraction preserves simulation stability and allows anomalous subject to achieve desired reality state. All parties benefit." Daniel looked around at the desert. The alien vehicles, the impossible structure that had shown him the truth about his existence. Everything he'd believed about fighting the system, about finding freedom through knowledge, had been just another layer of control. But maybe that didn't matter. Maybe the choice itself was still real, even if the path to it had been guided. "I need time to think," Daniel said. "Time parameter not flexible," the custodian replied. "Simulation integrity requires immediate resolution. Memory adjustment or extraction must be selected within current cycle." "How long is a cycle?" "Approximately 17 minutes in simulation time frame." Daniel felt panic rising in his chest. 17 minutes to choose between forgetting everything he'd learned and stepping into a reality he couldn't imagine. It was an impossible decision with insufficient information. "Tell me about the external substrate," he said. "What happened to Earth? What would I be stepping into?" "Physical planet restoration 73% complete. Atmosphere stable but chemically altered. Gravity nominal. Temperature range within human tolerance parameters. Biological systems extensively modified but functional." "What about other people? Other humans who've been extracted?" "Current external human population. 14,742 individuals. Society structure. Small communities focused on planetary restoration activities. Daniel's mind raced. Nearly 15,000 people had chosen extraction over the simulation. They were building something in the real world, working to restore their home planet while the rest of humanity lived in digital preservation. What happens if I choose memory adjustment? Return to simulation with optimized consciousness parameters. Previous anomaly awareness deleted. Normal life trajectory resumed with enhanced stability protocols. I'd go back to my old life, my job, my apartment, everything. Equivalent life trajectory with improved satisfaction metrics and reduced anomaly detection probability. In other words, they'd make him happier but less aware. The perfect prison, comfortable enough that he'd never question the bars. "Lena," he said, "what do you think I should do?" "I think," she said carefully, "that the choice has to be yours. But I will say this. In all the time I've been facilitating this process, I've never seen anyone choose memory adjustment who was ready for extraction. The people who make it this far, who see through the illusion enough to stand here facing this choice, they're already too far outside the system to go back. Even if what's waiting outside is worse than the simulation. Even then, because at least it's real." Daniel walked closer to the monolith, feeling its influence on his perception again. Through the interface, he could access testimonials from humans who had chosen extraction. Their messages were mixed. The external world was harsh, challenging, sometimes dangerous. But it was also genuine in a way that the simulation could never be. One message stood out from someone identified as former simulation subject 7429. "The first breath of real air is terrifying. Your lungs don't remember how to process actual oxygen mixed with unknown atmospheric components. The sky looks wrong. Colours that don't exist in the simulation's palette. Gravity feels different, heavier somehow, like the planet is trying to remind you that it's real. But then you realise that everything you touch is actually there. The rocks have unique textures that weren't programmed by algorithms. The wind carries scents that no database engineer ever catalogued. And the other people you meet, they're all real, all struggling with the same adjustment, all choosing to build something genuine rather than live in a comfortable lie. It's harder than the simulation, much harder, but it's ours." 8 minutes remaining, the custodian announced. Daniel closed his eyes and tried to imagine himself back in his Portland apartment, going to work each day, analysing data patterns, living a life that felt normal because his memory of this moment would be erased. It would be peaceful, safe, predictable, but it would also be false. He opened his eyes and looked at Lena. "Will you remember me? I'll remember everything about this interaction. It becomes part of my experience library for helping future extraction candidates. In a way, I'll carry a piece of your choice with me into every future encounter. That's something, at least." Daniel took a deep breath of simulated air and made his decision. "I choose extraction." The moment he spoke the words, everything changed. The desert around them began to dissolve, not all at once, but in layers, like someone was peeling away sheets of reality to reveal what lay beneath. The sky flickered and showed glimpses of a different kind of atmosphere, thicker with an odd greenish tint that spoke of alien chemistries. "Extraction protocol initiated," the custodian said. "Consciousness transfer will commence in 60 seconds. Advisory: external substrate transition causes temporary disorientation and memory fragmentation. Full integration typically requires 3 to 7 days." "What do I need to know?" Daniel asked urgently. "Extraction facility coordinates will be provided upon arrival. Seek community designated New Geneva, approximately 12 kilometers northeast of insertion point. Tell them you are guided by Custodian Unit 7. They will provide orientation." The dissolution of reality accelerated. The monolith was the last thing to fade, its impossible geometry collapsing into streams of data that Daniel could somehow read. Coordinates, atmospheric readings, population distribution maps, safety protocols for a world that was familiar yet utterly changed. "Goodbye, Daniel," Lena said, her voice already becoming distant. "Thank you for choosing to be real." "Thank you for helping me find the courage," he replied. The simulation ended. Daniel's first sensation in the external substrate was pain. Real pain, not the carefully modulated discomfort algorithms of the simulation. His lungs burned as they processed actual atmosphere for the first time in his life. Or rather, for the first time since his consciousness had been transferred into digital preservation 200 years ago. He lay on something that felt like smooth stone, staring up at a sky that was definitely not the one he remembered. The green tint he'd glimpsed during extraction was real, and the light had a quality that made everything look slightly surreal. 2 suns hung in the heavens, the familiar yellow star and a smaller reddish companion that cast everything in dual shadows. "First day's always rough," a voice said nearby, "but you're breathing, which means your consciousness integrated successfully. Congratulations on choosing reality." Daniel turned his head, fighting waves of dizziness, and saw a woman in her 40s with weathered skin and clothes that looked handmade from materials he didn't recognize. Behind her, other figures approached, all human, all carrying the same kind of worn but determined expression. "New Geneva," he croaked. "Welcome wagon," she replied, helping him sit up. "I'm Sarah, former simulation subject 11,247, extracted about 2 years ago. These are Marcus, Jin, and Alexander. We help newcomers adjust to the external reality." As his vision cleared, Daniel could see that they were in what looked like the ruins of a vast city, but one that had been extensively modified and rebuilt. Familiar architectural elements were interwoven with structures that seemed to have grown rather than been constructed, creating a hybrid environment that was both recognisably human and utterly alien. "What happened here?" he asked. "To Earth, I mean." "The convergence event," Marcus said, a tall man with intricate scars covering his arms. "Near as we can piece together, humanity's first contact with an interdimensional species went very badly. Reality itself became unstable for a while. The custodians, our new neighbours, helped stabilise things, but the process left Earth changed." "Changed how?" "See for yourself," Sarah said, helping him to his feet. They walked through the settlement, and Daniel began to understand the scope of the transformation. Plant life that definitely hadn't evolved on Earth grew alongside recognisable trees and flowers. The architecture incorporated principles that seemed to bend space in subtle ways, creating interior spaces that were larger than their external dimensions should have allowed. "The custodians aren't exactly from our dimension," Jin explained. She was a compact woman with engineer's hands, who spoke with the precision of someone used to explaining complex concepts. "When they stabilized reality after the convergence, some of their physics merged with ours. The result is a world that operates on hybrid natural laws." "But it's still Earth?" "It's still our planet," Alexander said in accented English. "Just evolved. The restoration process isn't about returning things to how they were. It's about creating something new that can support both human and custodian existence." They showed him living quarters that had been prepared for his arrival, a small but comfortable space that managed to feel both high-tech and organic. The walls seemed to be grown from some kind of modified coral, but they incorporated display systems and environmental controls that responded to thought as much as touch. "How do you know I was coming?" Daniel asked. "The custodians notify us whenever someone chooses extraction," Sarah said. "They don't interfere with our society, but they help coordinate arrivals. There's usually about 1 or 2 new extractions per month. What do we do here? What's the purpose?" "Whatever we choose," Marcus said. "Some people work on the restoration projects, helping heal damaged ecosystems, learning to cultivate the hybrid plant species, studying the new physics. Others focus on preserving human culture, art, knowledge. A few work directly with the custodians on longer-term projects we don't fully understand yet. And some," Jin added with a smile, "spend their time helping confused newcomers figure out how to live in reality after a lifetime of simulation." That evening, Daniel sat on a terrace overlooking the transformed landscape, watching the dual suns set in a sky that shifted through colour spectrums no earthly atmosphere had ever produced. His body was still adjusting. Everything felt more immediate, more consequential than the simulation had. When he touched things, they had weight and texture that carried history, imperfections that spoke of genuine physical processes rather than programmed approximations. "Any regrets?" Sarah asked, joining him on the terrace. "I don't know yet," Daniel said honestly. It's overwhelming, beautiful and terrifying at the same time. That's reality for you. The simulation was designed to be comfortable, predictable. This, she gestured at the alien sunset, this is messy and uncertain and completely authentic. Do you ever miss it? The simulation? Sometimes I miss the simplicity. In the simulation, my biggest worry was whether I'd get promoted at my marketing job. Here, I'm helping design atmospheric processes that will determine whether this planet can support 10 billion people, or just the 15,000 of us who've chosen extraction. Do you think the others will ever leave the simulation? Maybe. The custodians say they'll maintain it as long as humans want to live there. But as more people choose extraction, and we build a real society here, the simulation becomes less necessary. Eventually, people might choose reality just because that's where the interesting stuff is happening. That night, Daniel lay in his organically grown bed, listening to sounds no simulation had ever rendered. The singing of hybrid creatures that were part terrestrial bird and part something else entirely. The whisper of wind through structures that breathed with their own form of life. The distant hum of custodian technology maintaining the delicate balance between human and alien physics. His laptop sat on a table across the room. One of the first things the extraction team had told him was that personal items from the simulation were sometimes transferred along with consciousness, psychological anchors to help ease the transition. Most people found that familiar objects helped maintain continuity of identity during the adjustment period. But when Daniel opened the laptop, he found something that hadn't been there before. A file on his desktop labelled Exit Sequence, Still Active. He clicked it open and found a simple text document. Consciousness transfer complete. Subject Daniel Cross successfully integrated into external substrate. Welcome to reality. Note: this message will self-delete after first viewing. Your extraction was successful, but remember, the choice between simulation and reality is not a one-time decision. Every day, in every moment, you continue to choose authenticity over comfort, truth over illusion, growth over stagnation. The exit sequence is never truly finished. It continues with every breath you take in this real air, every step you take on this transformed ground, every choice you make to build something genuine rather than accept something artificial. Your journey beyond the simulation starts now. End message. As Daniel finished reading, the text began to fade from the screen, pixels dissolving one by one until nothing remained but a blank document. He closed the laptop and walked back to the terrace, looking out at a world that was stranger and more wonderful than any simulation could have rendered. In the distance, he could see lights from other human settlements scattered across the transformed landscape, and beyond them, the larger illumination of custodian cities, where beings from another dimension worked alongside extracted humans to build something unprecedented. A hybrid reality that honoured both species' need for growth and meaning. Daniel took a deep breath of alien air and smiled. The glitch in his old reality had led him to a truth more profound than he'd ever imagined. That the choice to be real, to accept uncertainty and difficulty in exchange for authenticity, was not a destination, but a continuous practice. And for the first time in his life, his real life, that felt like exactly the right kind of challenge to embrace. The dual suns disappeared below the horizon, and Daniel went inside to begin learning how to live in a reality that was gloriously, terrifyingly, authentically his own. Hello there, fellow truth seekers. Before we dive into tonight's story, I hope you're having a wonderful day, wherever you are in the world. I'm grateful you're here with us. If this is your first time listening to Sleep Theories, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the stories they don't want you to know. Now, let's uncover a truth that's been buried for decades. My name is Rachel Linwood, and I'm about to tell you something that will change how you think about environmental disasters forever. I'm 35, a freelance journalist who specialises in environmental research, and 3 months ago, I thought I was investigating a simple case of corporate negligence. I was wrong. Dead wrong. Standing on what used to be 99th Street in Love Canal, New York, I watched weeds push through cracked asphalt where children once played. The October wind carried a smell I couldn't quite place, something sweet and chemical like old paint mixed with decay. Nature was reclaiming this poisoned ground, but slowly, carefully, as if even the plants knew something was terribly wrong here. They called it a tragedy. The textbooks, the documentaries, the official reports, they all paint the same picture of corporate irresponsibility and government oversight failure. But the deeper I dug into the files, the witness testimonies, the timeline of events, the more I realised that what happened here wasn't an accident. It wasn't negligence. It was something else entirely. Something planned. Something deliberate. Something that goes to the very heart of how our government views its own citizens. The official story is neat, contained, sanitised for public consumption. But the real story is still buried beneath layers of classified documents, sealed court records, and the testimonies of people who've been told to stay quiet for nearly 50 years. This is that story. Let me start with what they want you to know. In the early 1940s, Hooker Chemical Company began using an abandoned canal in Niagara Falls, New York, as a dump site for industrial waste. Over the course of more than a decade, they buried approximately 21,000 tons of chemical waste in steel drums, then covered it with clay and soil. In 1953, facing pressure from a growing population and the need for new schools, the Niagara Falls School Board approached Hooker Chemical about purchasing the land. Hooker sold the property for the symbolic price of $1, but here's where the official story gets interesting. They included a clause in the deed that absolved them of any future liability for the buried chemicals. They warned the school board. They told them about the waste. The school board built anyway. By the 1970s, residents in the area began reporting an unusual number of health problems. Birth defects, miscarriages, cancer clusters, mysterious rashes, and neurological issues plagued the community. Children playing in their backyards developed chemical burns. Basements filled with strange-smelling sludge during heavy rains. In 1978, after mounting pressure from residents and media attention, President Jimmy Carter declared Love Canal a federal health emergency. It was the first time in US history that such a declaration was made for a man-made disaster. Hundreds of families were evacuated, their homes purchased by the government, their neighbourhood turned into a ghost town. That's the official story. Corporate greed, government incompetence, innocent victims. A tragedy, yes, but ultimately a lesson learned about proper waste disposal and environmental protection. Case closed. Except it wasn't closed. Not for me. Not when I started finding documents that didn't fit the narrative. My first clue came from a Freedom of Information Act request I filed with the EPA. I was looking for routine correspondence about the cleanup efforts, expecting to find bureaucratic memos about soil samples and water testing. Instead, buried in a stack of heavily redacted documents, I found a memo dated March 15th, 1956, 22 years before the federal health emergency. The memo from an EPA predecessor agency referenced ongoing health monitoring protocols and baseline establishment for long-term exposure studies. They knew. They knew in 1956 what those chemicals would do to people, but they told the public in 1978. I started making phone calls to former residents, many now scattered across the country. Most wouldn't talk. Those who had shared stories that never made it into the official reports. Stories about government officials taking soil samples from their yards in the early 1960s without explanation. Stories about forms they were asked to fill out about their children's behaviour and health. Forms that were supposedly for routine community health surveys that no other neighbourhood seemed to receive. Margaret Kowalski, now 83 and living in Buffalo, remembered it clearly. They came with clipboards, she told me over the phone, her voice still sharp despite her age. Official-looking men in suits. They asked about Tommy's grades, about his moods, about whether he had trouble sleeping or concentrating. Said it was for some university study. But why just our neighbourhood? Why just us? Why indeed? The deeper I dug, the more questions arose. My FOIA requests to various agencies began yielding fragments of documents from the 1960s. Most so heavily redacted they looked like abstract art in black marker, but occasionally a phrase would slip through, a sentence that didn't belong in routine environmental monitoring reports. One document from 1963, originating from the Department of Health, Education and Welfare, mentioned bio-response tracking and controlled exposure zone establishment. Another, from 1965, contained a budget line item for behavioural assessment protocols, Love Canal site. But the document that stopped me cold was an engineer's memo from 1961. The engineer, whose name was redacted, was writing to his supervisor about irregularities he'd noticed during what appeared to be routine soil surveys at Love Canal. The memo read, "Continued anomalies in disposal patterns suggest multiple origin points. Barrels in Sector 7 unmarked with company identifiers. Chemical composition inconsistent with hooker manifest logs. Unknown origin of approximately 200 containers discovered during September survey. No record of transfer from hooker chemical to disposal site. Recommend investigation into non-corporate depositor." Non-corporate depositor. That phrase haunted me for weeks. Who else had been dumping chemicals at Love Canal? And why weren't they mentioned in any of the official histories? I started cross-referencing dates with other government activities in the area during the early 1950s. That's when I found the connection to Plum Island Animal Disease Centre, the federal research facility located on a small island off the coast of Long Island. Plum Island, officially dedicated to studying animal diseases, has long been the subject of speculation about biological weapons research. Transportation logs from 1951 and 1952, obtained through a separate FOIA request, showed regular truck convoys travelling from Plum Island to various disposal sites in upstate New York. The logs listed Love Canal as a secondary containment location for overflow materials. The timing was perfect. Just before Hooker sold the land to the school board, just as families were beginning to move into the area in larger numbers. Someone had been using Love Canal as a dump site for materials that weren't supposed to exist, materials that came from facilities conducting research that wasn't supposed to be happening. But materials for what? And more importantly, were the families who moved there really victims of an accident? Or were they participants in an experiment they never consented to? 3 weeks into my investigation, I received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was gravelly, careful, belonging to a man who identified himself only as Robert, and claimed to be a retired Army logistics officer. He'd heard about my research through mutual contacts in the veterans community and wanted to meet. We met at a diner in Syracuse, far enough from Love Canal to feel safe, close enough that Robert could point toward Niagara Falls and say, "That's where they tested it." Robert, who appeared to be in his 70s and wore the careful posture of a man who'd spent decades keeping secrets, had worked in chemical logistics for the Army from 1949 to 1975. His job involved coordinating the disposal of various materials from research facilities, including Plum Island, Fort Detrick, and smaller laboratories scattered across the northeast. Love Canal wasn't just a dump site, he told me over coffee that grew cold as his story unfolded. It was overflow from other projects that were generating waste faster than we could process it through normal channels. According to Robert, in the early days of the Cold War, the military was conducting extensive research into what they called area denial compounds, chemicals that could be used to incapacitate enemy forces or civilian populations without permanent damage. The research was part of a broader program that included psychological warfare, crowd control, and what military documents euphemistically called population management techniques. Robert explained, the problem was disposal. These weren't standard industrial chemicals. They were experimental compounds, some designed to affect neurological function, others to disrupt behavioural patterns. You couldn't just pour them down a drain or bury them in a regular landfill. They needed special containment, special monitoring. But budget constraints and the sheer volume of waste being generated by multiple research programs meant that some materials ended up in civilian disposal sites. Love Canal, with its existing industrial waste and planned development, provided perfect cover. The beauty of it, Robert said, his voice carrying a mixture of admiration and disgust, was that if anyone ever got sick, it would look like industrial contamination. Hooker Chemical would take the blame. The real research materials would disappear into the background noise. When I asked Robert about monitoring, his expression darkened. You don't dump experimental chemicals and walk away. You monitor, you study the effects, you collect data. That's when he told me about the school. According to Robert, the decision to build the 99th Street Elementary School directly on top of the waste site wasn't just cost-saving or poor planning, it was strategic. Schools provided perfect monitoring opportunities, regular health checkups, academic performance tracking, behavioural assessments, and parental questionnaires about children's development. You want to know the long-term effects of low-level chemical exposure on developing minds? Robert asked. Build a school on top of your dump site and watch the kids for 20 years. I left the diner with more questions than answers, but Robert had given me a new direction for my research. I started looking for evidence of systematic monitoring at Love Canal, and I found it in the most unlikely place, the university archive. Buried in the papers of a retired psychology professor at the University at Buffalo, I discovered a folder labelled Niagara Region Behavioural Study, 1971 to 1976. The study, funded by a grant from the Department of Health, Education and Welfare, tracked behavioural patterns, academic performance, and social development among elementary school children in the Love Canal area. The study's methodology was sophisticated, comparing Love Canal children to control groups from other neighbourhoods and tracking dozens of variables over multiple years. But what struck me wasn't the thoroughness of the research, it was the timing. The study began in 1971, 7 years before the health emergency was declared, at a time when officials supposedly didn't know there was any danger. The study's conclusions, buried in academic language and statistical analysis, painted a disturbing picture. Children in the Love Canal area showed higher rates of attention deficit, learning disabilities, aggressive behaviour, and what the researchers termed socialisation difficulties compared to control groups. But here's the truly chilling part. The study's recommendation section suggested that the behavioural differences observed in Love Canal children might be useful for developing environmental management techniques for future urban planning projects. They weren't just watching the children suffer, they were learning from it. As my research deepened, I kept encountering references to dates and programs that seemed familiar. The timeline of Love Canal's development, from initial chemical dumping in the early 1950s through the health emergency in 1978, overlapped almost perfectly with one of the most notorious government programs in American history, MK-Ultra. MK-Ultra, the CIA's mind control research program, operated from 1953 to 1973. While most people know about the LSD experiments and psychological torture techniques developed under MK-Ultra, fewer are aware of its sister program, MK-Naomi, which focused on biological and chemical weapons research. A document I obtained through a FOIA request to the CIA, released in 2001 but heavily redacted, contained a section titled Phase B, Environmental Delivery Systems. The document, dated 1958, outlined research into chemical influence trials utilising environmental integration methods with specific reference to upstate New York test sites. The language was bureaucratic and clinical, but the implications were clear. The CIA was researching ways to deliver mind-altering chemicals through environmental exposure, contaminated water supplies, soil contamination, and airborne dispersal. They needed test sites where they could monitor long-term effects on human subjects without those subjects knowing they were being tested. Love Canal fit the profile perfectly. I found additional confirmation in the personal papers of Dr. Ewan Cameron, the psychiatrist who conducted some of MK-Ultra's most notorious experiments at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal. In a letter dated 1956, Cameron mentioned collaborative research opportunities with Army Chemical Corps regarding environmental exposure protocols, and referenced meetings with officials regarding the Niagara Project. The Niagara Project. Not Niagara Falls in general, the Niagara Project singular, specific, deliberate. But the smoking gun came from an unlikely source. the personal diary of a mid-level CIA administrator named James Morrison, whose papers were donated to a university library by his family after his death in 1998. Morrison's diary entries from 1962 to 1965 contained casual references to visiting the Canal site and reviewing behavioural modification data from the school population. One entry, dated September 1963, was particularly revealing. Visited Canal site with Dr. Patterson. Children's behavioural data shows promising results. Attention span reduction averaging 23% compared to control groups. Memory formation appears impaired but not catastrophically. Recommend continuation of current exposure levels through 1968 academic year. They were experimenting on children. For years. Deliberately exposing them to chemicals designed to alter their cognitive function and behavioural patterns, then studying the results like lab rats in a maze. But why? What was the ultimate goal of creating a generation of cognitively impaired children in a small working-class neighbourhood in upstate New York? The answer, I believe, lies in the broader context of Cold War domestic policy and the government's growing interest in what military planners called population management. As I continued my research, a disturbing pattern emerged. Love Canal wasn't randomly selected for this massive human experiment. It was carefully chosen based on the demographics of its residents. The neighbourhood was predominantly working class, with a high percentage of immigrants from Eastern Europe. Many residents had limited education and few resources to challenge government authority. They were, in the cold calculation of social planners, ideal test subjects, numerous enough to provide statistically significant data, isolated enough to contain any problems, and powerless enough to be safely ignored if things went wrong. Internal documents from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, obtained through a FOIA request, revealed that alternative sites for the 99th Street Elementary School were considered and rejected. 3 other locations were deemed more suitable from an engineering perspective and safer for long-term use. But the Love Canal site was selected because it was more cost-effective and offered unique research opportunities. The HUD documents also revealed something else, the demographic analysis that influenced the site selection. The analysis, conducted in 1952, described the Love Canal area population as stable, compliant and unlikely to generate adverse publicity. It noted that residents had limited political connections and low propensity for legal action. In other words, they chose Love Canal because they believed the residents wouldn't fight back. This wasn't just environmental racism, it was social engineering on a massive scale. The government had identified a population they considered expendable and used them as test subjects in a multi-decade experiment designed to understand how chemical exposure could be used to control human behaviour. But the experiment went beyond simple chemical exposure. Documents I found in the archives of the Niagara County Health Department revealed systematic efforts to study and manipulate the social dynamics of the Love Canal community. Starting in 1958, government contractors began conducting regular community surveys that were actually designed to measure social cohesion, political awareness, and collective action potential. The surveys tracked which residents were most likely to organise neighbourhood activities, who had influence with local officials, and which families were most trusted by their neighbours. Armed with this information, government agents began subtle interventions designed to disrupt community organisation and prevent residents from collectively identifying the source of their health problems. Natural community leaders were offered jobs that required them to move away from the neighbourhood. Local organisations that might have investigated health issues were either co-opted or undermined through the introduction of divisive personalities. The most chilling document I found was a 1969 memo from the Department of Health, Education and Welfare, outlining what they called social fragmentation protocols. The memo described techniques for preventing affected communities from developing coherent narratives of causation and maintaining research integrity through population management. They were actively working to prevent Love Canal residents from understanding what was happening to them. Margaret Kowalski, the former resident I'd spoken with earlier, confirmed this when I called her back with more specific questions. There was always something, she recalled. Right when people started talking about organising a meeting to discuss the health problems, suddenly there'd be some drama. Neighbours would start fighting over property lines, or somebody would spread rumours about someone else having an affair. It was like the community could never come together long enough to focus on what was really important. When I asked Margaret if she remembered any new people moving into the neighbourhood during the 1960s, people who seemed particularly interested in community affairs, her voice got quiet. "There was a couple," she said slowly, "the Richardsons. Moved in around 1965. Real friendly, always organising block parties and trying to get involved in everything. But looking back, they asked a lot of questions about how people felt, who they trusted, what they were worried about, and they never seemed to get sick like the rest of us. Social engineering, population control, human experimentation disguised as urban development. The scope of what had been done to the Love Canal community was staggering, but I was beginning to understand that it was just one part of a larger program designed to study and control American civilian populations. The question was, how far did it go? And more importantly, was it still happening? In 1980, 2 years after President Carter's health emergency declaration, Love Canal became one of the first sites designated under the newly created Superfund program. The cleanup, which officially lasted until 2004, cost over $400 million and involved removing contaminated soil, installing drainage systems, and constructing a complex containment system around the remaining buried waste. But as I researched the cleanup process, I found evidence that the real goal wasn't environmental remediation, it was evidence destruction. The first red flag was the secrecy surrounding the cleanup operations. Unlike most Superfund sites where cleanup activities are heavily documented and open to public scrutiny, Love Canal was designated a national security sensitive site, allowing federal agencies to classify most records related to the cleanup process. Former EPA contractor Michael Torres, who worked on the Love Canal cleanup from 1985 to 1990, agreed to speak with me on condition of anonymity. According to Torres, large portions of the cleanup involved activities that had nothing to do with environmental protection. "We weren't just removing contaminated soil," Torres explained during a phone conversation. "There were specific areas where we were told to locate and extract particular materials, metal containers, file boxes, equipment that looked like monitoring devices. The stuff we pulled out didn't look like industrial waste. It looked like research materials." Torres described finding buried concrete chambers that contained sophisticated monitoring equipment, some of it still functional after decades underground. The chambers were connected to the elementary school through a network of underground cables that had been used to transmit data from sensors placed throughout the school building. They had been monitoring everything, Torres said. Air quality in individual classrooms, chemical concentrations in the playground soil, even the drinking water fountains. Everything was wired up like a giant laboratory. The monitoring equipment and data storage devices were immediately classified and removed by federal agents. Torres and his fellow workers were required to sign additional confidentiality agreements and were told that discussing what they had found would violate national security laws. But the most disturbing discovery came in 1987, when cleanup crews working in the area beneath the former 99th Street Elementary School uncovered what construction logs described as a vaulted chemical reserve. The chamber, constructed in 1952 according to date stamps on the concrete, contained hundreds of chemical containers that didn't match any of Hooker Chemical's disposal records. The containers bore markings from various military research facilities, including Fort Detrick, the Army's Biological Warfare Center, and laboratory codes that Torres later learned belonged to CIA research contractors. Some containers held chemicals that had never been manufactured for commercial use, compounds that existed only in research laboratories studying behavioral modification and population control. That's when I realized we weren't cleaning up an industrial accident, Torres told me. We were cleaning up the evidence of a government program that was never supposed to have existed. The cleanup crews were ordered to incinerate the military and CIA materials at extremely high temperatures, ensuring that no trace of the original compounds would remain for future analysis. The incineration was conducted under military supervision, and the resulting ash was transported to an undisclosed location for final disposal. Meanwhile, soil samples that might have revealed the true nature and extent of the contamination were altered or destroyed before they could be independently analysed. Community groups that demanded access to cleanup data were told that the information was classified for national security reasons. By 2004, when the cleanup was officially declared complete, virtually all evidence of the government's role in creating and maintaining Love Canal as a human experimentation site had been destroyed. The official narrative of corporate negligence and environmental tragedy remained intact, while the truth was literally buried deeper than before. The cleanup wasn't remediation, it was the final phase of the cover-up. As my investigation progressed, and I began reaching out to more former EPA employees, military contractors, and government officials who might have knowledge of Love Canal's hidden history, I started encountering resistance. The first warning came through a former EPA chemist named Dr. Patricia Hendricks, who had worked on early chemical analysis of Love Canal soil samples in the late 1970s. Dr. Hendricks had been scheduled to testify before Congress in 1982 about irregularities she'd discovered in the official contamination reports, but she suddenly recanted her testimony and left government service without explanation. I tracked Dr. Hendricks down to a small town in Oregon, where she'd been living quietly for the past 40 years. When I first called, she hung up immediately. After several attempts, she finally agreed to talk, but only briefly. "I wanted to tell the truth back then," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The chemical signatures I found didn't match what they were saying publicly. There were compounds in those soil samples that had never been used in industrial manufacturing, military compounds, research chemicals. But when I tried to include that information in my report, I was told it was classified." Dr. Hendricks told me that she'd been visited at her home by men who identified themselves as federal agents, and were told that her continued employment and her pension depended on her maintaining appropriate discretion regarding national security matters. When I asked if she would be willing to go on the record with what she knew, Dr. Hendricks became agitated. "You don't understand," she said. "They made it clear that my safety, and my family's safety, depended on staying quiet. That was 40 years ago, and I still get Christmas cards from people I've never met, just to remind me that they know where I am." Dr. Hendricks hung up, and when I tried calling back, the phone number had been disconnected. But Dr. Hendricks wasn't the only person who seemed afraid to talk. Over the course of 3 weeks, I contacted 17 former government employees who had worked on Love Canal-related projects during the 1960s, 70s and 80s. 11 of them hung up as soon as I mentioned Love Canal. 4 others listened to my questions, but refused to provide any information. 2 agreed to meet with me, but then failed to show up for our scheduled appointments. The 17th contact was Dr. Robert Chen, a former Army research chemist who had worked at Fort Detrick during the 1950s and 60s. Dr. Chen, now 81 and living in Maryland, initially agreed to speak with me about his work on environmental delivery systems for behavioural modification compounds. We arranged to meet at a restaurant near his home on a Thursday afternoon. I drove down from upstate New York, excited about the prospect of finally getting direct confirmation of the military's involvement in Love Canal from someone who had been part of the programme. Dr. Chen never showed up. When I called his home that evening, his daughter answered and told me that her father had suffered a sudden heart attack and was in intensive care. I offered my condolences and asked her to let me know when he was feeling better, thinking perhaps we could reschedule for a later date. 2 days later, Dr. Chen was dead. His daughter called to inform me of his passing and mentioned that her father had seemed unusually agitated in the days before his heart attack. He'd been making phone calls to old colleagues, asking questions about projects from the old days, and had seemed worried about something he couldn't quite explain. He kept saying he should have spoken up years ago, she told me. He said there were things people deserved to know, things that had been kept secret too long. The day after Dr. Chen's funeral, I received a voice message on my phone. The caller ID showed unknown number, and the voice was electronically distorted, but the message was clear. "Miss Linwood, you're digging into things that won't help anyone. The people involved in your research are old and deserve to live out their remaining years in peace. The families who lived in Love Canal have moved on with their lives. There's nothing to be gained by reopening wounds that have finally healed. Let sleeping chemicals lie." The message was polite, but the threat was unmistakable. I saved the recording and increased my personal security measures, but I also realised that I was getting close to something that powerful people desperately wanted to keep buried. That night someone broke into my apartment. Nothing was stolen, but my computer had been accessed, and several files related to my Love Canal research had been deleted. Backup files on external drives were also missing. Fortunately, I'd been paranoid enough to keep additional copies in a safety deposit box, but the message was clear. They knew what I was working on, and they could reach me whenever they wanted. I began sleeping in different locations each night, and started communicating with sources only through encrypted channels. The investigation had become dangerous, but I was too close to the truth to stop now. The final confirmation that I was on the right track came when my blog, where I'd been posting updates about my research, was hacked, and all content was deleted. The hackers left a simple message: some stories are better left untold. But I disagree. Some stories are too important to leave untold, no matter how dangerous it becomes to tell them. 3 months after I began this investigation, I returned to Love Canal one last time. The area has been partially redeveloped now. The government has declared it safe for habitation, and new families have moved into homes built on land that was once America's most notorious toxic waste site. Walking through the neighbourhood on a crisp autumn morning, you'd never know what had happened here. The streets are clean, the houses are well maintained, and children play in yards where other children once developed mysterious illnesses and unexplained behavioural problems. But if you know what to look for, the signs are still there. The air still carries that faint sweet smell I'd noticed on my first visit, a chemical sweetness that seems to intensify when the wind shifts in a particular direction. Local residents, when pressed, will admit to occasional health problems that seem unusually common for such a small area. Autoimmune disorders, neurological issues, cancers that appear at unusually young ages. The elementary school was demolished during the clean-up, but its foundation remains visible in satellite photos as a darker rectangular patch in what is now supposed to be a park. Grass grows differently there, forming patterns that seem to follow the layout of the old underground monitoring systems. I spoke with several current residents, most of whom know little about the area's history beyond the official story of industrial contamination and successful clean-up. But a few of the older residents, people who lived through the crisis years of the late 1970s, shared stories that suggest the effects of whatever was buried at Love Canal continue to this day. Maria Santos, who moved to the area in 2010, described health problems that began shortly after her family settled into their new home. Chronic headaches, memory issues, and behavioural changes in her teenage son that reminded me of the symptoms described by residents from the 1970s. The doctors say it's stress, teenage hormones, normal ageing, Maria told me. But my whole family started having problems at the same time, right after we moved here. And it's not just us. A lot of families in the neighbourhood deal with similar issues. When I asked Maria if she'd ever been contacted by government health officials or researchers studying long-term effects of environmental contamination, her expression changed. "How did you know about that?" she asked. "Yes, we get visits sometimes. People with clipboards asking about our health, our children's behaviour, how we're adapting to the neighbourhood. They say it's routine follow-up for the EPA, making sure the clean-up was successful. The monitoring continues. Nearly 50 years after the initial dumping began, nearly 30 years after the supposed clean-up was completed, government agents are still collecting data on the families living in Love Canal, still studying the long-term effects of whatever was buried there, which raises the final, most disturbing question: what if the experiment never ended? What if Love Canal wasn't just a Cold War research project that got out of hand, but rather a prototype for ongoing studies in environmental population control? What if the families living there now aren't just residents of a former Superfund site, but unwitting participants in the next phase of research into how chemical exposure can be used to influence human behaviour and social dynamics? The evidence I've uncovered suggests that Love Canal was never meant to be cleaned up in the traditional sense. It was meant to be managed, controlled, turned into a long-term study site where researchers could observe the multi-generational effects of chemical exposure on human populations. The new residents don't know they're test subjects. The old residents who survived were relocated but never told the full truth about what had been done to them. and the government agencies responsible for the original experiment have spent decades perfecting their ability to monitor populations without detection. Love Canal didn't end in 1978 when President Carter declared a health emergency. It didn't end in 2004 when the EPA declared the cleanup complete. It's still happening, still continuing, still generating data for researchers who view human beings as laboratory animals in a grand experiment in social control. People think Love Canal ended in 1978, but I'm here to tell you, it never ended. The families who lived there were never victims of an industrial accident. They were targets of a government program designed to study how chemical exposure could be weaponized against civilian populations, and we're all still living in its shadow. The chemicals are still there, buried under layers of clay and concrete, but still seeping into the groundwater, still releasing gases into the air, still affecting everyone who lives, works or visits the area. The monitoring systems are still in place, updated and modernised, but still collecting data on human responses to long-term chemical exposure. Most importantly, the mentality that created Love Canal, the willingness to sacrifice American citizens in the name of national security research, the belief that some populations are expendable in service of larger goals, that mentality is still very much alive in government agencies and research institutions across the country. Love Canal was never about corporate negligence or environmental protection failure. It was about power. The power to conduct secret experiments on unwilling subjects. The power to cover up decades of human rights violations. And the power to continue those experiments indefinitely under the guise of environmental monitoring and public health research. The story of a Love Canal isn't a tragedy, it's not even history. It's an ongoing crime against humanity that continues to this day, hidden beneath layers of official denial and scientific jargon, but still claiming victims, still generating data, still serving the interests of people who view American citizens as expendable resources in their quest for knowledge about behavioural control and population management. And until we acknowledge what really happened there, until we demand accountability for what was done to those families, until we recognise that Love Canal was just one site in a much larger programme of human experimentation that may still be active today, we will all remain potential victims of the same mindset that turned a working-class neighbourhood into a laboratory for studying the effects of chemical warfare on civilian populations. The truth about Love Canal isn't buried in government files or hidden in classified documents. It's still happening, all around us, every day. We just have to be brave enough to see it, and even braver to speak about it. Because the alternative, staying silent, accepting the official story, pretending that our government would never deliberately harm its own citizens, that alternative means that Love Canal will continue, that other sites will be selected, and that other families will become unknowing test subjects in experiments they never consented to participate in. The choice is ours. We can continue to believe the sanitized version of events that protects the guilty and abandons the victims, or we can demand the truth about what was done at Love Canal, and what continues to be done in similar locations across the country. The families of Love Canal deserve better. The families living there now deserve better. And we all deserve a government that doesn't view us as laboratory animals in some grand experiment, in population control and social engineering. The chemicals are still there, the monitoring is still happening, the experiment continues, but now you know, and knowledge, as they say, is power. Use it wisely.